Good evening, how's everybody doing? Good to be learning with you on a Sunday, Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house as it's raining? It's raining here in LA. It's rained pretty hard at times, but so far, thank God, this tropical storm is not too bad where we live. Inland, actually, in what's normally the desert, the hot, really hot areas that often, won't get moisture when we do closer to the coast. That's where they're having serious problems and flooding. So we pray that everyone will be spared. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Yehudit in South Carolina, Carla in Brazil, Sharon in New Jersey, Yitzhak in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, Lucy in Minnesota, Paula's in the house, Joe in the Inland Empire, Melissa in Great Neck, Bill in Mid-Missouri. Sharon, please, we need a mishaberach, a healing, for my husband's brother, Bob Ben Zion Moshe Ben Miriam, whose cancer has metastasized to lung and liver. Please God, send a refuah shlema, a complete healing, a complete and speedy healing to Ben Zion Moshe Ben Miriam. We all say amen. May we only hear good news, Sharon. Also welcoming David in South Bend, Paul in Minneapolis, as well as Ella, Marjorie in Virginia, Gwen saying good evening, Lynn in Maryland, Michelle in Washington, Gigi in Vancouver. My cousin from Vancouver checked in with me. How's it going down here with the hurricane? And by the way, we had an earthquake also today, although it was centered in Ojai, which is about an hour drive away, a little more than an hour. So, we had an earthcane or a hurricane. But he asked me from Vancouver, how's the hurricane treating you? How's the rain treating you? I said, to be honest, it's probably like an average day in Vancouver so far, and may it stay that way. All right, my friends, we're going to cover, with God's help, 2 pages today here in Tractate Kiddushin, the 20th volume of the Talmud. We are on Mishna number 1 of chapter 1. A woman is acquired for betrothal in one of 3 ways, meaning that they create a betrothal and then she becomes prohibited to all other men, and she and this man are betrothed to each other. And if they're going to break off the betrothal, they will need a get, a bill of divorce. And what are those 3 ways? With money, or the equivalent of money, with a document known as a shtar, or with bia, sexual intercourse, which they engage in for the purpose of creating betrothal. They have to have that intent. And the Mishna also said that a woman acquires herself in 2 ways, meaning she exits marriage, or she exits this state of being prohibited to all others. And what would that be? With a get, right, that ends the marriage, or if the husband dies, right? Isn't that what the 2 ways were? Acquires herself, yes, through a get or the death of her husband. Okay, we pick this up on page 3a. We went a little bit of the way into 3a yesterday, and this is going to allow us to cover 2 pages today. The Daf Yomi schedule would have us on page 7. We'll get through page 4, so we're catching up. We're getting pretty close. The Gemara continues to analyze the language of our Mishnah with regard to the number in the first clause. A woman is acquired in one of 3 ways. So this serves to exclude what? Right? The Mishnah said, the Gemara is now asking, well, if the Mishnah said there are 3 ways, what does that mean? Why does it say 3? What's interesting is what the Gemara is really asking is, was there a 4th way that we might have thought would be a way in which betrothal could be created, but in fact is excluded? Right? So a woman is acquired in 3 ways, and this serves to exclude what? The fact that the Mishnah mentions a number indicates that other modes of acquisition do not apply to betrothal. So what mode, what potential or possible mode of betrothal was excluded? And similarly, the number in the latter clause of the Mishnah, a woman acquires herself in 2 ways, but it says the number 2. So are there other modes that we might have thought would work, which are in fact excluded? So the Gemara explains the number in the first clause, she's acquired in 3 ways, serves to exclude the chuppah. Right, so we remember that the way that betrothal and marriage were practiced in Talmudic times, the betrothal was usually a year before the marriage. So the betrothal, known as erison or Kiddushin, which is the way the sages referred to it, that's the betrothal, and then the marriage is called nisuin or chuppah, right? That the couple stands under the wedding canopy. Exchange the vows. You are hereby, but you are. What is the language of marriage? You are hereby consecrated to me, I believe, under the laws of Moses, right? Whatever. We'll get to that later. But the point is, what we normally think of as a Jewish wedding is that the couple stands under the chuppah, the wedding canopy. So what the Mishna, what the Gemara is asking here is, well, what if they skipped the betrothal and they went right to the chuppah? They're going to get married, aren't they, by virtue of standing under the chuppah? And so now that they're married, does it matter that they were never actually betrothed? Answer, yeah, it matters, as we'll see. So the Gemara explains, the number in the first clause serves to exclude a wedding canopy, a chuppah, which does not affect betrothal. And the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rav Huna, who said that the chuppah does acquire a woman, and it alone could be a mode of betrothal, as derived by a kal v'chomer inference, and a fortiori influence, which we're going to see on page 5. So this number serves to exclude what? In other words, Rav Huna is in the minority who says, well, actually, if you go straight to the chuppah, the betrothal is included in that. But he's in the minority. The majority would say you have to have betrothal and then chuppah, and if you skip betrothal, you have a big problem. Okay, so now the Gemara is asking, okay, well, if we just go with the minority opinion, according to Rav Huna, who allows the couple to proceed straight to the chuppah and create a marriage, why wouldn't we include that in the Mishna and just say at least, and according to Rav Huna, a fourth mode of betrothal would be going straight to chuppah. But it doesn't say that. Why? So the Gemara answers, the number 3 in our Mishnah serves to exclude acquisition through symbolic exchange, right? So something else that's being excluded. What is symbolic exchange? A pro forma act of acquisition affecting the transfer of ownership of an article. Although a woman can be betrothed by means of money or an item of monetary value, she is not betrothed if she is given an item by symbolic exchange. Right? It doesn't have to be a very valuable item that she's given, but it cannot be a symbolic item, right? Something that only has symbolic value and no actual value. And the Gemara explains why this needs to be excluded from the 3 ways of acquisition, the 3 ways of betrothal. It might enter your mind to say that since the sages derive the acquisition of a woman by verbal analogy between the term expressing taking, stated with regard to betrothal in the Torah, and is connected to the term taking that's stated in the Torah with regard to Abraham purchasing the field to bury his wife in that contains the cave of Machpelah, which he purchased from Ephron the Hittite. And since the word taking is included in both those places, that's how we derive that a woman can be betrothed, right, through money, an exchange of money. So the Gemara explains why this needs to be excluded. It might enter your mind to say that since the sages derive the acquisition of a woman with money by using the word taking with the language of betrothal and taking in the language of the acquisition of the field of Ephron, so it can be suggested that since a field can also be acquired through a symbolic exchange, so too a woman can be acquired through symbolic exchange. Therefore, the rabbi of the Mishnah teaches us that this is not the case. And the Gemara asks, and perhaps one should say that so too, it is possible to betroth a woman by means of symbolic exchange. And the Gemara answers, this cannot be the case. A symbolic exchange is effective using an item worth less than the value of one peruta. The minimum value, if you're going to give an item, to create betrothal with a woman, has to be worth at least one peruta. Symbolic exchange could be worth even less than that. But that will not work for betrothal. And with an item worth less than the value of one peruta, a woman does not render herself acquired by a man. And the Gemara asks, and now we're on page 3b, the number in the latter clause of the Mishna that a woman acquires herself in two ways serves to exclude what? And the Gemara answers that it serves to exclude halitza, i.e. a woman is not released from marriage through halitza. Halitza is the ritual that a widow performs when her husband died before he had any children and he left a brother. So the brother, the yavam, and the widow, the yavama, have a levirate bond, and they have an obligation to either have sexual intercourse, which means they are become married, and their first child will be considered the heir of the brother who died, and any children after that will be the heirs of the second husband, the brother. But if the widow and the surviving brother don't want to marry each other, they must perform halitza, right? This ritual ceremony called halitza. So since halitza releases a levirate bond, releases the yavama from the yavam, we might have thought that you could also use halitza to create a divorce. That's what they're suggesting here. I.e. a woman, and so our Mishnah teaches us that a woman is not released from marriage through halitza. Without this exclusion, it might enter your mind to say that this can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference and a fortiori inference from the law of a yavama, like this. Just as a yavama, the widow, who is not released from the yavam through a bill of divorce, is nevertheless released from him through halitza, with regard to this married woman who can be released through a bill of divorce, is it not logical that she could also be released through halitza? Therefore, our Mishnah is teaching us that a married woman cannot be released from her husband by means of halitza. Marriage only ends when he gives her a get, the bill of divorce, or he dies. And the Gemara asks, and perhaps one should say that so too, this is the case, i.e. a married woman can be released from marriage through halitza. And the Gemara answers, no. The verse states, with regard to divorce, Deuteronomy 24:3, a scroll of severance must be given to her, which teaches a scroll, i.e. a written document, severs her from her husband, and nothing else severs her from her husband. So we cannot use halitza to create a divorce. And the Mishnah teaches that a woman can be acquired with money. And the Gemara asks, from where do we derive that a woman can be acquired through money? Right, an object worth money or money itself. Now, it's not that she's being purchased, right? The money goes to her, unless she's a minor, in which case it would go to her father, which is also, in ancient times, a way that a father could actually sell his daughter into servitude. But here what we're talking about is that the wife is going to receive money herself from the husband. And this is not some huge amount of money. We're not purchasing a slave here. We're just saying it is a kind of symbolic transaction, but it has to have a minimum value. And it's a very small minimum, but there is a minimum. So from where do we derive that one of those three ways of creating betrothal is with money? How do we know this? And furthermore, with regard to that which we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Ketubot, page 46b, a father has authority over his daughter with regard to her betrothal, whether it is through money, through a document, or through sexual intercourse. From where do we derive that she is acquired by her husband with money, and that this money is her father's? And the Rav Yehuda said that Rav said the reason is that the verse states with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, right, a female slave, but a Hebrew female slave, when a Jew would become a slave to another Jew, it was not a permanent slavery. It was more like an indentured servitude that would last 6 years. Right? So Rav Yehuda said that Rav said the reason is that the verse states with regard to a Hebrew maidservant acquiring freedom from her master, Exodus 21:11, then shall she go out for nothing, without money. Now, the extraneous phrase, without money, indicates that there is no money for this master, i.e., in this case, the master she leaves loses the money that he paid for her, but there is money for a different master, i.e., another master receives money for her when she leaves his authority. And who is this other master who can transfer her to someone else and receive money for her? This is her father. And that, right? So, I mean, tragically in the ancient world, sometimes a family would be so poor that they couldn't feed, this child, and so they would take some money to feed, I guess, the rest of the family, and sell her to a family where she would work for 6 years, but at least she would survive, right? That's what's going on here. Hopefully, it's not just cruelty and insensitivity that would lead to a father to sell the daughter like that. Terrible, terrible outcome, but the world then is not like the world now. Now, without money indicates that there is no money for this. Who is that master? This is her father. Now, the Gemara asks, but why not say that this money is given to her? And the Gemara rejects this. How can one suggest this? Her father receives her betrothal, i.e., the money or document of betrothal, when he marries her off to her husband. As it is written, I gave my daughter to this man, Deuteronomy 22:16. And shall she take the money? Since he is the one who marries her off, he is certainly entitled to the money of her betrothal. Little background note, a girl younger than 12 years old may be sold as a Hebrew maidservant by her father. In many cases, a Hebrew maidservant was designated to become the wife of her master or his son. If he or his son does not marry her, she becomes free when she attains majority after working 6 years upon her purchaser's death or with the advent of the Jubilee year. So interesting, if the father sold her when she was 11, and then, or even like the day before her birthday when she becomes 12, she goes free as soon as she reaches her majority. So it could be a very short-lived servitude. But if he sold her when she was 6, okay, so she would serve for 6 years. Or if the purchaser died. Right? Now, if he or his son does not marry her, then she becomes free when she attains majority, after working 6 years upon the purchaser's death or with the advent of the Jubilee year, the Yovel, whichever happens first. If a maidservant is released, her master receives no monetary compensation as discussed here. He knew what he was getting into. He wasn't going to get paid, and he can't sell her. Right? He can purchase a maidservant, but he can't sell her, a Hebrew maidservant. That's as opposed to a Canaanite slave. Now, the Gemara asks, but why not say that this law applies only when she is a minor girl, as she does not have the power to receive her betrothal? Since she lacks the intellectual capacity, she likewise does not have the legal right to conduct this transaction. But with regard to a young woman who does have the power to receive her own betrothal, as a female older than 12 years is considered an adult, let her betroth herself and take the money. And the Gemara answers that the verse states, being in her youth in her father's house, which teaches any profit she gains in her youth belongs to her father. When she gains her majority at the age of 12, she's going to be, held to the standards of an adult for certain things, but she is still sustained by her father, as we see. Now, the Gemara questions this explanation, but with regard to that which Rav Huna says that Rav says, from where is it derived that the earnings of a daughter, i.e. profit from her labor, belongs to her father, as it is stated, and if a man sells his daughter as a maidservant. And this comparison between a daughter and a Hebrew maidservant teaches the following. Just as with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, her earnings belong to her master, so too with regard to a daughter, her earnings belong to her father. And the Gemara now asks, why does Rav Huna need this derivation? Let him derive this law from the verse, being in her youth, in her father's house, which indicates that any profit from her earnings as a young woman belongs to her father. So rather, Rav Huna maintains that that verse is written with regard to the nullification of vows, right? So women have this extra advantage that if they take a vow, if they're living in their father's house, he can nullify it for them. If they're married, their husband can nullify it for them. You might think that that's a sort of a power imbalance, that the husband can nullify his wife's vows. But generally speaking, we shouldn't take any vows. And if we do, we might well come to regret it. Men have no option but to go seek out a halakhic authority that maybe will be able to find an out so that you can nullify that vow. But women have this advantage that they can also have the vow nullified by their father or husband, which is usually a preferred outcome even for them. Where am I? So Rav Huna maintains that verse is written with regard to the nullification of vows, and it is not referring to the laws of acquisition. The Gemara asks, if that is so, then so too with regard to her betrothal money. One can say that this verse is written only with regard to the nullification of vows and does not apply to betrothal money. And if you would say, let us derive the law of her betrothal money from the law of the nullification of vows, i.e., just as a father has the right to nullify his daughter's vows when she is a young woman, so too he has rights to her money. This is not possible, as there is a principle: we do not derive monetary matters from ritual matters. And if you would say, let us derive this law of the betrothal of a young woman from the law of fines, right? A fine that is paid as a penalty, as it is stated explicitly in the Torah, that a man who rapes a young woman must pay a fine to her father. There is another principle that is applicable here. We do not derive monetary matters from fines, as the imposition of a fine is considered a unique case every time a fine is mentioned in the Torah, and we don't derive other monetary laws from the laws of fines, right? Now recall that, if a woman is raped, there's a specific fine that the rapist has to pay for the rape, right? That's the fine, but that is not the extent to which he is liable for damages. There's also humiliation, there's suffering, there's medical, and a rapist, if the woman, or in this case a young girl, a young woman, wants to marry him, he has to marry her, and he can never divorce her. He loses that right to divorce her. He'll have to sustain her for the rest of his life because he raped her. So there are many punishments that are meted out to a rapist in the Torah, but this particular one, the fine, is its own thing, and we don't learn out monetary laws for other matters from the law of the rapist's fine. And if you would say, let us derive this law from the reimbursements for the humiliation and degradation of a young woman who was raped, which are also given to the father when she's living in his house, one can answer that the following distinction applies. Reimbursement for humiliation and degradation are different, as her father has an interest in them. Meaning, the father has the ability to derive benefit. The language is odd here. The father has the ability to derive benefit from her humiliation and degradation in other ways. For example, by marrying her to a man afflicted with boils, which would humiliate her and cause a reduction in her value. Therefore, one cannot derive from the fact that the father receives the reimbursements for the humiliation and degradation of a young woman, meaning a woman living in his house, who was raped, that he receives other monies that are due to her. Now remember, when they speak about matters like this, which are obviously so fraught with emotion and difficult to discuss, it's not that the analysis here is heartless and insensitive to the pain and suffering of the young lady. They're just confining the discussion to very, specific monetary laws that they're deriving, which monetary laws apply in which situations. Continuing, rather, the law that a young woman's betrothal money belongs to her father is derived from the verse, then shall she go out for nothing, without money, as previously stated. And there they're talking about a female maidservant. What does that have to do with betrothal? As for the question why the money does not belong to her, the Gemara answers that it is reasonable that when the verse excludes another situation and indicates that there is no money for this master, but there is money for a different master, it excludes a departure that is like it, i.e. a departure wherein the two masters are the potential recipients. So, just as when no money is paid, the individual who might have received the payment is her master, so too, when money is paid, in a different set of circumstances, the money goes to the one who has authority over her, meaning her father. Now we're on page 4a, and the Gemara asks, but this departure is not similar to that departure. Right? One is leaving her father's house to become married, another is leaving her father's house to become a maidservant. And the third is leaving the master's authority when, she comes of age or she has served for 6 years as a maidservant. So says the Gemara, but this departure is not similar to that departure, as there she leaves the authority of the master entirely upon being freed. If she was serving as a maidservant and she came of age, or she finished her 6 years of servitude, then when she leaves, that master has no relationship to her anymore in the future. Nothing. He has no hold over her whatsoever. Whereas when she leaves her father's house to go, be married, for example, if the marriage doesn't work out, she might well return to her father's house and live there. So there is a continuing relationship in that sense. Where am I? Right, she leaves the authority of the master entirely upon being freed, and she no longer retains any connection to him. And here, she still lacks the act of passing over to the wedding canopy. Until she actually enters the wedding canopy, she has not left her father's authority. Not completely. And the Gemara answers, nevertheless, there is a similarity between her departures in both cases, as she leaves her father's authority at least as far as the nullification of vows is concerned. As we learned in a Mishna, with regard to a betrothed young woman, her father and her husband together nullify her vows, and her father can no longer nullify them alone once she is betrothed. After she's fully married, then only her husband can nullify her vows, and her father no longer even participates in that. Now the Gemara asks, but does this verse, then shall she go out for nothing, come for that purpose, to teach that there is no money for this master, but there is money for a different master? But that verse is required for that which is taught in a different place, a different baraisa. As it is taught in that baraisa, the verse, then shall she go out for nothing, without money, should be understood like this. Then shall she go out for nothing. These words are referring to the days of adulthood, i.e., a Hebrew maidservant leaves her owner's authority once she becomes an adult. Without money, ein kesef, these words are referring to the days of her youth, i.e., when she becomes a young woman, she leaves his authority. And Ravina said, if so, that the verse is to be used only for this derivation, let the verse say en kasef, without the letter yud. What is indicated by the full spelling with a yud, ein kesef? This serves to teach the law stated above. There is no money for this master, but there is money for the different master. And who is he? That is her father. So the Gemara explains, and from where is it derived that one interprets this verse homiletically in this manner? How is it known that the full form of the word ein with the yud teaches a law? As it is taught in a baraisa with regard to the daughter of a priest who married a non-priest and was subsequently... My phone is just... Stop. I hope we're not interrupted. This is a flash flood warning about, the storm that we're having in the area. Okay, looks like we're still broadcasting. Good. Where am I? All right, so how do we know that adding this yud to the word en and making it ein with regard to money, that this is the correct interpretation that we should take from that yud? As it is taught in a baraisa with regard to the daughter of a priest who married a non-priest and was subsequently widowed or divorced, and she has no child and is returned to her father's house, as in her youth she may eat of her father's bread, right? If she's a priest's daughter while she lives in her father's house, she can eat teruma, food that is consecrated for the use of priests and their households. So a priest's wife, a priest's daughter, can eat teruma. If she marries a Yisrael, right, a non-priest, then she leaves her father's house and she can no longer eat teruma. Let's say that she's then widowed or divorced and returns to her father's house. Can she resume eating teruma in her father's house? Answer, yes, unless she had children by the Yisrael, her husband, while she was out of her father's house, as we shall see. Right, as it is taught in Baraisa with regard to the daughter of a priest who married a non-priest and was subsequently widowed or divorced, and she has no child and is returned to her father's house. As in her youth, she may eat of her father's bread. Leviticus 22:13. This verse indicates that if she has no children from her non-priest husband, she may once again partake of teruma. Now, I've derived only that this law applies to her actual children. From where do I derive that her children's children are equivalent to children with regard to this law? Now, if she has children's children, she has a grandchild, what difference does it make whether she has a grandchild or not? Obviously, she had a child if she also had a grandchild, but you might say that if her child, God forbid, died, then she can return to her father's house and eat teruma. But what if her child's child is still around? Is that going to exclude her from eating teruma when she returns to her father's household? So I've derived only this law applies to her actual children. From where do I derive that her children's children are also included in this law? The verse states she has no child, ein la, where the ain is spelled with a yud inserted in the middle. And this additional letter serves to enable an alternative articulation of the term. Specifically, one examines her, ayin la, like ain la, but you could also say it ayin la, to see if she has any descendants. And I've derived only that this law applies to children of unflawed lineage, i.e. her legitimate offspring. From where do I derive that even if she has children of flawed lineage, meaning she had an adulterous affair and produced a child through that adultery, which would be a mamzer, does this child disqualify her from returning to her father's house and eating his teruma if her marriage ends? Answer, yes. How do we know that? The verse states she has no child, which indicates that one examines her as explained above. So even if she has no living child, but she has a grandchild or she has a mamzer child, she can no longer eat teruma when she returns to her father's house. With regard to this last derivation, the Gemara asks, but you have already derived one law from this word, that her children's children are considered like her children in this case. And the Gemara answers, so how can you derive that also a mamzer is included? And the Gemara answers, in fact, the verse was not necessary to teach about her children's children, as there is an established principle that one's children's children, right, one's grandchildren, are considered like his children or her children. And therefore, when the verse was necessary, it was to teach the requirement of examining her children of flawed lineage. Right, that even the mamzer would disqualify her. Because her children's children, we wouldn't need to go to the yud and make an interpretation, because your grandchildren are always considered like your children for these kinds of laws. And the Gemara asks, and the Tana, the rabbi of the Mishna himself, from where does he know that one can expound the yud in the word ain in this manner? And the Gemara answers, they say in explanation that it is written, Numbers 22:14, the story of Bilam and Balak, right? Bilam was the Gentile prophet that the king Balak brought to try and have him curse the children of Israel while they were still in the wilderness. And it says Bilam refuses, Bilam me'en, and it is similarly written, Mayavam refuses, me'en, in Deuteronomy 25:7, and in neither case is a yud written. And here the word ain is written with a yud, and learn from it that the word yud that the letter yud is superfluous and comes for the sake of an exposition. So the Gemara comments, and it was necessary to write a verse that teaches that her betrothal, i.e. the money or document of betrothal, belongs to her father. And it was necessary to write another verse that teaches that her earnings belong to her father, as one could not derive one law from the other, as if the merciful one had written only that her betrothal money belongs to her father. I would say that this is because she did not toil for it, and therefore is not entitled to this sum, right? And you could say that the father raised his child, invested a lot in the child, as it were, And so when it's time to marry her off, if there's going to be an exchange, even a symbolic exchange of money for the purpose of betrothal, that would go to the father. But why are you going to say that if a document is created for the purpose of betrothal, why doesn't she keep the document? Why should that go to the father? But with regard to her, but they're not comparing it to the document. That betrothal money goes to the father. I would say that this is because she did not toil for it, and therefore she is not entitled to this sum. But with regard to her earnings, for which she herself toiled, say that they are hers. Why do we assume that her earnings while she lives in her father's house would belong to her father? Therefore, it was necessary to state that her earnings also belong to her father through this exposition. And conversely, if the verse had taught us only the law of her earnings, one would have said that they belong to her father because his daughter is sustained by him through his property. But with regard to her betrothal, i.e. the money or document of betrothal, which comes to her from an external source, you might say that it is hers. Therefore, it was necessary for the verse to teach us both laws. And the Gemara returns to the matter itself. The Baraisa states with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, then shall she go out for nothing. These are the days of adulthood. Without money, these are the days of her youth. And the Gemara asks, and let the merciful one write that she leaves her master when she reaches her youth. And it would not be necessary to state that she leaves upon reaching adulthood, right? Meaning she's a child, then she's a youth, and then she's an adult. And the difference between a youth and an adult is 6 months, right? She becomes a youth, a young woman at 12, and a woman at 12 and a half in this scheme. So if she's if she's a maidservant and she's going to become free when she's 12, why do we also have to say that she becomes free when she's 12 and a half? She already was free. It would not be necessary. And Rabbah says this phrase comes and teaches us about that phrase. In other words, since it is not explicitly stated that this particular verse is referring to her departure as a maidservant when she becomes a young woman, if there was only one superfluous phrase, one could conclude that it is referring to adulthood, as the law that she leaves the master when she becomes an adult is a lesser novelty. Therefore, 2 extraneous verses were required to teach this principle. And Rabbah cites an analogous case. This is just as it is with regard to a tenant and a hired worker. As it is taught in a Baraisa concerning teruma, the verse states, a tenant of a priest or a hired worker shall not eat of the consecrated, right? We've said many times that the household of a priest can eat his teruma. And what is his household? His wife, his daughter or his son, and his Canaanite slaves. But what about a Hebrew slave who's only going to be there for a finite amount of time? What about a tenant? And what about a hired worker? They live in his house. May they partake of his teruma. As it is taught in a Baraisa concerning teruma, the verse states, a tenant of a priest or a hired worker shall not eat of the consecrated. Leviticus 22:10. Now, a tenant, this is referring to a Hebrew slave who has been acquired as a permanent acquisition, i.e. one who said he wishes to stay with his master. Now, that's very interesting. We understand that if a Hebrew became a slave, if a Jew became a slave because he stole or because he got into debt and couldn't get out of debt or he just couldn't eat, he just couldn't feed himself, and so he sold himself into slavery to another Jew for 6 years of servitude. Now, it might happen that while he's serving in his master's house, he's like, you know what? I have it much better off here. I have a great master. He treats me very well. He gives me my own, guest house out back. I'm prospering. He's made me the superintendent, of his operation here. I like it where I am. I'm going to stay. And the Torah provides that a Hebrew slave who's only for 6 years can, by his choice, become a permanent slave of his master. And there's a ritual for that, where they put his ear up against the door frame and they actually, pierce his ear, symbolically that he's now going to be a permanent slave of his master. Now, if his master is a priest, we understand that a indentured servant, right, a temporary Hebrew slave of a priest cannot partake of teruma. But when he becomes a permanent slave of that priest master, you might think that he would be able to partake of teruma. And so this verse comes and tells you, no, he does not. Right? Where am I? A tenant, this is referring to a Hebrew slave who has been acquired as a permanent acquisition. This Hebrew slave has his ear pierced and he remains with his master until the Jubilee year, right, which comes every 50 years. And a hired worker, this is referring to a Hebrew slave who has been acquired for an acquisition of 6 years, the standard period of servitude for a Hebrew slave. Neither of these, the permanent slave or the 6-year slave, if it's a Hebrew slave, can eat of his master's teruma if his master is a priest. And the Baraisa asks, let the verse say tenant and let it not say hired worker. And I would say, if one who is acquired as a permanent acquisition does not partake of his owner's, i.e. the priest's teruma, as despite his status as a Hebrew slave, he is not considered his owner's property, is it not all the more so that one who is acquired for an acquisition of 6 years should not be permitted to partake of teruma? Like, once we know that the permanent Hebrew slave is not going to be allowed to eat his master's teruma if his master is a priest, does it need to be said that the 6-year slave is not going to be able to partake of it either? And the Baraisa answers, if so that the verse were stated in this manner, I would say a tenant, this is one who is acquired for an acquisition of 6 years, as the term itself is ambiguous, but one who was acquired as a permanent acquisition may partake of teruma. Therefore, the term hired worker, which is certainly referring to one who is less permanent than a tenant, comes and teaches about the meaning of the term tenant, that even if a Hebrew slave was acquired as a permanent acquisition, he may not partake of teruma, and a similar line of reasoning applies in the above case of a young woman and an adult. Now, what they're not even talking about is what we would normally call a tenant or a hired worker, like somebody who's renting the guest house at the priest's, place. Or a live-in maid, for example, who's a professional who's getting paid. You might have thought, well, can they partake of teruma? And it would seem, we're not really discussing that question here, but it would seem that if even the Hebrew slave was going to be there for 6 years, or the Hebrew slave was going to be permanently part of that house, so they may not eat teruma, all the more so. Right, one who's just a renter living in that house or one who is just a housekeeper working in that house is not going to be eating teruma. Obviously, they need to be fed. They can eat the priest's food. They just can't eat consecrated food that only priests and their immediate households can eat. Right? And Abaye said to Rabbah, are these cases really comparable? There, the tenant and the hired worker are two bodies, right? Two different people. And this is significant, as even if the merciful one had written explicitly that a pierced tenant, right, the Hebrew slave who becomes a permanent slave, may not partake of teruma, from which the law of a Hebrew slave for 6 years could have been inferred, and then the merciful one wrote the other case of a Hebrew slave acquired temporarily, this would not present a serious difficulty. And the reason is that although the law of a hired worker is a matter that could be derived by means of the Kal V'chomer inference, and therefore it does not have to be stated explicitly, there is a principle that sometimes with regard to a matter that could be derived through that Kal V'chomer inference, right? If in the easy case, if in the big case, the law is like this, then in the lesser included case, obviously the law is going to be like that. That's a Kal V'chomer inference. So sometimes there are matters that could be derived through the Kal V'chomer inference, and nevertheless, the Torah states it explicitly. We find examples of that. So you can't assume that just because it is stated explicitly, that we should be deriving some other law than the one that we might have derived through the Kal V'chomer. But here, with regard to a woman, she is one body, i.e., she is the same Hebrew maidservant. Once she has left upon the arrival of her youth, meaning she was sold as a child to a master, and then she becomes a 12-year-old, and so that's it. Her servitude is over. She goes back to her father's house. Or her master can marry her, or marry her to his son. Now, once she has left upon the arrival, if she consents, once she has left upon the arrival of her youth, what is she doing in his authority as an adult? It is entirely unnecessary for the verse to teach that she leaves her master upon becoming an adult, because she has already left him when she simply came of age. So rather, Abaye rejects the previous suggestion that one verse teaches about the other, and he said the claim that the verse, then shall she go out for nothing, this verse is actually referring to adulthood, and it is necessary only for the adulthood of an alonis, a sexually undeveloped woman, an underdeveloped woman who will never be capable of bearing children. An alonis or alonit will never develop the physical signs of maturity. Consequently, she does not go through the halakhic stage of becoming a young woman. Instead, she remains a minor until the age of 20, at which point she immediately becomes an adult. Consequently, if the Torah did not... Why? Because when does she becomes a young woman when she's 12. She becomes an adult. We call it 12 and a half, but that's kind of the approximate age. It's really when she hits puberty. Then she becomes an adult. This alonis will never hit puberty. They're still waiting for her to develop the physical signs of puberty. She never hits that because she's sexually underdeveloped. So at the age of 20, they say, well, we're not waiting anymore. You are an adult at that point. But consequently, she does not go through the halakhic stage of a young woman. Instead, she remains a minor until the age of 20, at which point she becomes an adult. Now, consequently, if the Torah did not teach that a Hebrew maidservant leaves her master upon becoming an adult, it might enter your mind to say she leaves only when entering her youth. But when entering adulthood directly, she does not leave. Since the alonis is never classified as a young woman, she would never leave servitude. Therefore, the verse teaches us that a Hebrew maidservant leaves her master even if she reaches adulthood directly. Now, Mar Bar Rav Ashi objects to this, but is it not a kal v'chomer inference? And if the signs indicating that a young woman has entered puberty do not fully release a young woman from her father's authority, as he can still betroth her, nevertheless they do release her from the master's authority, is it not logical that adulthood, which completely releases her from her father's authority, now she betroths herself, her father has nothing to do with it, should this not also release her from the master's authority? So if so, one can derive by this reasoning that an alonis leaves her master in adulthood, which means that this verse was unnecessary. So rather, Mar Bar Rav Ashi says this verse is necessary only with regard to the basic law of the sale of an alonis as a Hebrew maidservant, as it might enter your mind to say that if a female will show the signs of a young woman, i.e. puberty, her sale is a valid sale, whereas in a case where she will not show the signs of a young woman, her sale is not a valid sale. And the reason one might think this is the case... The reason one might think that this is the case is that if the maidservant turns out to be an alonis, one cannot fulfill the requirements of the verse, as she will never become a young woman. Therefore, the superfluous phrase, then shall she go out for nothing without money, teaches us that even an alonis can be sold as a Hebrew maidservant and is released upon reaching adulthood. Now we're on 4b. And the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Mar Bar Rav Ashi, who said, but is it not a kal v'chomer inference that adulthood releases a woman from her master's authority? How does he respond to the fact that we say in general, with regard to a matter that can be derived through a kal v'chomer inference, the verse nevertheless takes the trouble and writes it explicitly? And the Gemara answers that matter applies only where there is no other way to resolve the difficulty of why a law is written when it could have been derived through the kal v'chomer inference. But when there is another more substantial way to resolve the difficulty, one resolves it in that manner. New subject. The Gemara notes, and a Tana cites, right, a rabbi of the Mishna cites the law that a woman can be betrothed with money from a different source, as it is taught in a baraisa that when the verse states, when a man takes a woman and engages in sexual intercourse with her, and it comes to pass if she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some unseemly matter in her, and he writes her a scroll of severance. This is the law of the get. This is the law of divorce, right? But the Torah does not actually spell out how we create betrothal and marriage. We actually derive it from this source where it's talking about the get, right? When the bill of divorce happens. So it's implied that they were married, that they're going to be divorced, right? And so it says here in the law of the get that this man has sexual intercourse with her, meaning they're married. So we could see that the Torah spells out that sexual intercourse is a way to create betrothal. From where do we know that betrothal could also be created, with an exchange of money or with an exchange of a document? And now this is what the Gemara is explaining. Right? So, now in this verse, the term taking is only with money, right? So, because it's said when a man takes a woman. And that word takes, we see, was tied to when Abraham bought the field from Ephron, where the word take was also, he said, here's the money for the field, take it from me. And because that word take is used in both places, that's how we derive that money is one of the methods for creating betrothal. And so it says, I will give money for the field, take it from me. So we talked about this before. Now the Gemara asks, but is there any need for this derivation? Why do we have to go to this comparison of taking in the law of divorce, which created the marriage that led to the divorce, and taking between Abraham and Ephron? Maybe there's an easier way to derive that money can create betrothal. Could this not be derived through a kal v'chomer inference as follows? And if a Hebrew maidservant who cannot be acquired as a maidservant through intercourse nevertheless can be acquired through money, is it not logical that this woman who can be acquired through intercourse for the purpose of betrothal can also be acquired through money? Right? They're making the case that you don't acquire a female maidservant through intercourse. It's only through money, right? Somebody, the new master buys her from her father. So that can be accomplished through money, even though sexual intercourse will not create that. In terms of betrothal, which can be created through sexual intercourse, is not logical through this kal v'chomer inference that it could also be created through money. But the Gemara will refute this kal v'chomer inference. A yevama proves otherwise, as, right, the widow of a man who died childless and leaving a brother, a yevama proves otherwise, as she is acquired by the yavam, the brother, of her husband who died through intercourse, right? Yavam and a yavam perform yibum, that means they have intercourse, and then they are married. So a yavama is acquired through intercourse, but she cannot be acquired through money. The only way for the yavam and the yavam to get married is to perform intercourse. There is no money or document for creating that betrothal and marriage. Now the Gemara rejects this refutation. What is unique about a yavama is that she cannot be acquired through a document. Will you say that the same applies to this woman who can be acquired through a document for the purpose of betrothal, and consequently the acquisition of money applies to her as well? So the Gemara reiterates this question. The verse states, when a man takes a woman, why do I need a verse for this purpose? It was already derived through this kal v'chomer inference, as the proposed refutation of this inference was rejected. So Rav Ashi said, it is needed because one can say that the refutation of the kal v'chomer inference is present from the outset, i.e. there is a difficulty with the comparison between a woman and a Hebrew maidservant. And Rav Ashi explains, from where do you derive that a woman can be betrothed with money? It is derived through the kal v'chomer inference from the case of a Hebrew maidservant, and this derivation can be refuted. What is unique about a Hebrew maidservant is that she can be released with money, i.e. she pays her master her value as a maidservant, and then she is freed, and therefore she can likewise be acquired through money. Will you say the same with regard to a woman who becomes a wife? She cannot be released through money. She can't pay her husband and obtain her divorce that way. So this kal v'chomer inference is rejected. So one must rely on the source cited in the Baraisa that a woman can be betrothed through money, because of taking is used in that verse, and taking is used in the verse about Abraham acquiring the field from Ephron. After mentioning an additional proof for the option of betrothal with money, the Gemara comments, and it was necessary for the Torah to write, with regard to a Hebrew maidservant, then shall she go out for nothing. And it was also necessary to write, when a man takes a woman, as if the merciful one had written only, when he takes, I would say, the betrothal money that the husband gives her is invariably hers. Therefore, the merciful one writes, then she shall go out for nothing, to teach that when she is not an adult, her father has the right to her betrothal money. When she is an adult, she gets the betrothal money. And conversely, had the merciful one written only, then shall she go out for nothing, I would say that in the case where she gave him money and betrothed him, it is a valid betrothal, as this verse does not specify who gives the money to whom. Therefore, the merciful one writes, when he takes and not when she takes, to teach that only a man may betroth a woman and not vice versa. And the Brisa continues to interpret the verse, the phrase, and engages in sexual intercourse with her. This teaches that a woman can be acquired through intercourse. Why is it necessary for the verse to state this explicitly? Could this not be derived through a kal v'chomer inference? And if a yevama who cannot be acquired through money can be acquired through intercourse, is it not logical that this woman who can be acquired through money, as derived above, can also be acquired through intercourse? And the Gemara counters, and now I'm almost done. Questions or comments, get them in. The case of a Hebrew maidservant proves otherwise, as she is acquired through money, and yet she cannot be acquired through intercourse. But the Gemara dismisses that refutation. What is different about a Hebrew maidservant is that her acquisition is not for the sake of marriage, as she is acquired as a servant. Would you say the same with regard to this woman, whose acquisition is for the sake of marriage? Therefore, it is logical that a woman can be acquired through sexual intercourse. But the Gemara reiterates its question. The verse states, and engages in sexual intercourse with her. But why do I need a verse for this purpose? It was already derived through the above kal v'chomer inference. And Rav Ashi said it is needed because it is possible to say that the refutation of the kal v'chomer is present from the outset. And from where do you derive that intercourse is a mode of acquisition? From the case of the yevama. But one could say, what is unique about a yevama is that she is bound to the yavam and stands waiting for him to act. And for this reason, sexual intercourse is sufficient to render her his wife. Will you say the same with regard to this woman in a regular marriage who is not bound and is not standing waiting for anyone? It is therefore possible that intercourse is not enough to acquire a woman in ordinary circumstances. Consequently, the kal v'chomer does not bear close scrutiny, and it is for this reason that an additional proof is required that the verse states in the Torah and engages in sexual intercourse with her. So what the sages have done is shown through exhaustive analysis why our Mishnah holds that betrothal is created either through intercourse with the intention of creating betrothal, or through the husband giving her money if she's an adult, or giving her father money if she is living in her father's household as a minor, or even a young woman, right? Or the equivalent of money, or by the document, right? Creating a document of betrothal. Those are the three ways, and that's what they have derived here. Okay, the hour is late. Let's take a couple of comments and questions, if we've got them. I loaded the Google Docs, and it unloaded me, but now I reload. Come on. Oh, Nina's saying no comments or questions on Kiddushin 3 and 4. Very good. Pray for us that the rain doesn't get too serious. It's raining pretty hard out there now, and the people really in harm's way of this storm, may they be spared. And I look forward to learning with you, my holy sisters and brothers, tomorrow, Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.